Okay, guys. Well, welcome back. It's nice to see a little reunion going on here. As you know, Nando's comes in a number of flavors, and they normally don't even want me to talk too much about them. But I had some Nando's the other day, and I sometimes like a little lemon and herb. But I have a feeling today we either are going to go for that Mozambican peri peri, or we're going to end up extra hot. And I keep a bottle of that. I keep a bottle of that Nando's extra hot sauce in the fridge. And you know what it goes with? Well, all the other takeout places that aren't Nando's. It improves their food.
Now that is spicy.
There is truth in what you say there, Gareth.
So I can't help feeling like the burning platform is like putting sauce on what is otherwise a fairly bland political landscape. But I don't know if you can say that for this week.
What? Bland political landscape? Gareth.
No, come on, for me. I mean, mostly these politicians talk such claptrap. If you take it straight from them, it's terrible. But I think if we analyze some of this stuff, I saw Fikile Mbalula this week had a total Twitter meltdown. He went after Kebi Mapatswe and who was the other one? Who else did he go?
He went up. And Carl Niehaus. He went after Carl Niehaus.
That's right.
Kevin Mphatso and Ace. He was just wilding.
Now, okay, so there are a few things we need to discuss here. First of all, every time I've ever observed Fikile Mbalula, he is not an independent thinker. All right, and I mean that in the kindest and most complimentary possible way.
No. Explain that. How is that a kind and complimentary thing to say?
He will lick whichever ass is above his. That's what I mean. Since you've asked me for clarification, I will be very clear about it. So, Fikile Mbalula is well known to lick the ass of whoever is above him on the tree. So it used to be Jacob Zuma, and as long as he was in the cabinet, he continued to lick ass. Now he's doing that with Cyril, and he knows who Cyril's enemies are. But apparently, the fight started when Kebi and Carl Niehaus went after him because, of course, he controls a lot of budget as transport minister. There's a huge amount of money that he could spend. So it all boils down to the money in the end. And they don't like what he's doing with the money because, for all we know, those two who are probably rotten, I mean, I'm speculating now, so I don't want to get into trouble, but they're probably rotten. I mean, a lot of people in the ANC are. That's common knowledge. They're after the money. So this fight isn't really...
Gareth, I must say I'm impressed. It's a long time since you've expressed a specific opinion on any matter or individual.
Isn't that the point of this show?
Yes, but normally you let the rest of us do that. So, welcome to the team.
You wanted to say something on this story, and then we'll move on to a more important
No,
of course.
Look, I think it very specifically, though, it's not just the budget that he handles at transport, but very specifically around a security contract at PRASA. And various iterations thereof, which have been ongoing problems, part of the ongoing problems at PRASA. But this security contract, which was then ring-fenced and allowed to be something that's what was called the Mkhonto veterans would be responsible for this security contract. And there have been so many problems. We've seen every other week, we see lots of footage of how the stations, how the railroads are dismantled. And it's only the PRASA stations and PRASA railroads. The Transnet ones are intact.
Right. Yes.
So that's where the start out is. But it's not entirely fair of Mbalula to go after Kebi. After all, he only has one hand.
Shame, but he was in a porno, wasn't he?
What? He was?
You didn't know about that? Kebi, man.
It wasn't a porno. It was a leaked picture. It was a leaked picture by a slay queen of sorts.
There was a leaked
just when you thought your husband was safe because he has one arm. The slay queens take no prisoners.
The slay queens do not care.
They take no prisoners.
So who we got in the ANC who are porn stars at the moment? We've got
number one,
Malusi Gigaba. Yeah. Number two, Kebi Mapatswe. These are not the people you would have necessarily chosen to star in porn, but there they are, the ANC's best, and the ANC's always looking for the next best leader. So, all right, Do you want to add anything on Fikile Mbalula, Canton? Because I don't mind moving on.
No,
He's
I think we
sweating
should.
bullets, though.
I think we should move on. Look, again, Mbalula is ultimately a distraction, and I keep trying to get people to focus on the fact that these minions are the distraction, but the person who leaves them in power is the person that we should be constantly looking at, and that is our Presidente, Cyril Ramaphosa. So any malfeasance on the part of the likes of Mbalula ultimately goes back to the fact that his boss refuses to fire him. So let's just keep that at the back of our minds all the time.
So, Catherine, I love the distraction, because today, one day ahead of Senegal, I think everybody is watching to see what happens tomorrow at Senegal with EFF as, what do they call him? Commander-in-Chief, CIC, saying the fighters must attack. And Stian Hazen saying that they're poking a bear there, right? So that was Stian Hazen on Sunday saying they're poking a bear. But I'm of the view that all of this is simply just a distraction. This is the EFF's strategy. So if we think about the EFF and what they did to Jacob Zuma, they basically had decided that they were never going to allow Jacob Zuma. They were going to cause chaos around him and never allow him to speak. If he needed to speak, that's what they were doing. And they've taken a similar strategy with Cyril, right? And their strategy with Cyril is they're going to foment such chaos around him. And he's not going to be able to do anything, because then they're just goading him. So the Senegal thing is goading Cyril to take a move, whether he sends in the police, then they can say, look, this is what he does. He protects white interests. And this is exactly his MO. Look what happened in Marikana. He's doing the same thing.
I have a different view on this completely. My view on this is that Cyril actually very much wants to see what happens in the standoff, because this is really kind of testing the waters in terms of what actually happens in the event of the ANC actually coming down with substantial repression. I mean, yes, we've been seeing repression over this lockdown period, but it has actually been kind of, putting their toes in the water, so to speak, just to get a sense of what's actually going on. And right now, what they have is an opportunity to actually see a face-off between potentially armed Boers and the EFF, who ultimately are their minions. And to try and get a sense of, well, if we decide to keep pushing this rampant theft that we've actually embarked on to its next logical conclusion, which is to actually expropriate white property without compensation, because fundamentally it does boil down to white property that they are talking about. How far can we push these guys? And
a bunch of Indians and Khaleds just went,
yes, well, no, but frankly, guys, we should again avoid seeing the ANC and the EFF as different entities. Let's be very clear about this.
Kind of what Pumi's saying is that that's the role they play, but they also, within that more general movement, they are the ones who are constantly causing distractions. They're very good at stealing headlines. They're very good at fomenting tensions, creating and upscaling the talking points. And I mean, you've got to give them credit, because very few parties get that right in the world. I mean, it's the EFF, Donald Trump, and the Chinese Communist Party that are good at this.
Well, whether Donald Trump is good at it, we'll actually see when the elections come around, won't we?
We will have to see. And the thing about it, Gareth, and because that's where they are, right? So the EFF is in that sweet spot where they're about to move into, they're just on five years. And if we look at what it looks like to cement yourself as a movement, they are now on about 10% representation in parliament. If they can move themselves up into a kind of 15 to 20% representation, then we're here with the EFF distracting us at every turn for a long time to go. And I was actually reading an article about Trumpism, even, is this election is going to, because it's a particular brand of politics that Trump is pushing as well, beyond just himself and being the greatest ever to live, to do it.
It took us 17 minutes to bring up Donald Trump's name, and I'm sorry, it was my fault. So before we go there, chomping at the bit to get to Donald Trump, or maybe you're not. I don't know, Canton. You just shook your head.
Well, shall we just do a kind of perfunctory reference to the fact that yesterday, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma extended the national state of disaster?
Yeah,
I saw that in the middle of the night. Didn't it come through at like 9 p.m. last night?
I forget what time it came through, but it got gazetted yesterday. So, extension of national state of disaster, COVID-19. I, Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, as designated under Section 3 of the Disaster Management Act, blah, 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 hereby extend the national state of disaster that I extended to 15th October 2020. Taking into account the need to continue augmenting the existing legislation and contingency arrangements undertaken by organs of state to address the impact of the disaster. There's not much there that one can actually then take to court and challenge, because it's not really giving details in terms of what needs to be augmented.
Details is when she's telling us what we can't buy in very specific terms. Or when she's telling us what we can't wear in very specific terms. So
no, that was Ibrahim Patel. Please let's not do a disservice to Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma.
Well, I think that this is actually quite outrageous that she just keeps extending it, because we know that the deaths are down to, I think it was in total last week there were like 8 people who died. So this is no longer, because if we're going to declare a disaster for 8 people who died because of a specific disease, then please will someone tell the TB sufferers and the people who are dying of HIV, AIDS related illnesses, and the people who've got cancer and all the other things, suicide, frankly, we should be declaring a state of disaster for that too. So it's become a caricature. And I went off on a tirade on, I think it was Monday morning, about this very thing. I think it's enough already. You know, the veil has fallen from before our eyes, and there are governments all over the world who've made this mistake. It's not just ours. But I do think that the charade is kind of over now. We need to take off all of this paraphernalia around this one particular disease, which we've completely and hopelessly overreacted to in this country and in others, and move on. Because level 1, whatever it means, whatever it still means people can't come in or out of the country at leisure. And that there are still certain places that you can't go, and that there are certain things we must wear and do, and these rituals, these religious rituals that we're all partaking in. I think it's time to kind of call it out for the nonsense that it is now. Or do you think I'm jumping ahead of the gun?
It's a drum roll for Kempin just tweeted the CDC article. Do you want to talk about that, Kempin?
Let's talk about that.
Look, the CDC article, once again, this stuff has nuance, but for the benefit of people who haven't actually read the article, well, it wasn't actually an article. It was an advisory that was put up by the Center for Disease Control based on the data that they'd accumulated up until July. And this report was then collated in September and was finally released this week. And effectively what it says is that in 70% of the cases where people were infected, those people had worn masks and they had followed the CDC guidelines.
Hold on, let me just get that right. 70% of the cases where people had been infected, they were wearing masks.
They were wearing masks and they otherwise followed CDC guidelines. Okay. So that's kind of the broad brushstrokes. Now, what this boils down to is not whether the CDC guidelines in of themselves are ineffective, but the question that I'd like people to focus on is the fact that masks in of themselves are absolutely useless in terms of preventing people from actually catching the virus. But again, that's something that we've known from the get-go, because the entire purpose around it was never to prevent actually getting infected yourself, but to actually reduce the possibility of transmitting if you happen to have it. Because there's real evidence that it slows down the spread. It doesn't completely block it. But we do know that the virus will effectively travel through a mask if the person opposite you happens to have it and happens to have a mask. But fundamentally, again, this goes back to the numbers that we spoke about, and the Panda guys had similar data that showed that masks were actually an ineffective means of preventing the spread of COVID. And the CDC data is in fact bearing out what the Panda guys have been saying for months.
Well, you mentioned the Panda guys because we had Nick Hudson on not so long ago, and I thought that was really, really an interesting episode.
2 weeks ago, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But Warren has just mentioned another guest that we had before. He read War Party, the book by Greg Arday, and he said it's definitely worth a read. Any kind of related to this transport security business stuff, it all makes sense to him now because he's read Greg Arday's book. So well done to Greg. There's a compliment for him a couple of weeks after he was on the Burning Platform. So, Plums, what kind of stories, besides all the COVID-related ones, which frankly I think a lot of people are just bored with, not because they don't care and not because we haven't all been concerned and our lives haven't been upended by this thing, but I think almost there's a little bit of fatigue setting in now around these stories. And even people who were very interested a week or two ago have now gone, you know what? It's something we've just got to cope with. We've got to find new ways of dealing with it. What else is there in the world that is interesting? And one of the stories that's come up, and it's been quietly going on behind the scenes. We've been talking, I remember us on the Burning Platform, you, Canton, and I saying, please, Shamila Batoy, can we have something done? Well, the Special Investigating Unit has more than 5,500 employees of Eskom in their crosshairs after investigations into fraud, corruption, and maladministration continue at the power utility. So the Standing Committee in Parliament on Public Accounts has been updating their probe into dodgy coal, diesel, and building contracts involving billions of taxpayers' rands. And they have decided that they're going to follow up these investigations by checking out 5,500 of these Eskom employees. I mean, that does sound like progress. Let's obviously see what it results in, because investigations on their own, nothing. Are you hopeful?
Not really. And I'll tell you why. I think in the past 2 weeks, we've seen a lot of like Hollywood style excitement. And yesterday, funny enough, was Agreezy's bail hearing and all that that was detailed with that. And then I am just, and that's all well and good to get the ball to start going. But if we think about even a Zandile Kumete's story, right? Zandile Kumete from KZN, she appeared in front of a judge to get her charges read to her last May, I think it was. We're still waiting for something to move on Zandile Kumete. She then gets suspended on full pay. Nothing happens. So we have a big, cameras are there. We see Zandile Kumete standing in front of the magistrate's court. All of these things, for me, are just, and that's also, ultimately, that's what happened with the Scorpions. And that's why, when they say that is the part of the reason why they got disbanded, is because we see the start of something and it's all very exciting, and then it just fizzles out. We're still waiting. It's over a year now. We're waiting to hear what's going to happen with Zandile. Why isn't it being prosecuted? Why isn't it, being brought to a close? Let them prosecute them. Let them stand up there and say, sorry, we don't have enough evidence or whatever it is. But, the farce of seeing cameras and people being arrested because of, and there are 21 cars being confiscated. Suga. Just for the cameras. We must see action. We want to see people in overalls. We want to see people in orange overalls. Then we will feel like something is moving.
But the reality is that with all of these things, the wheels of justice turn slowly. We did see Richard Mdluli go to jail the other day. I mean, it has been, 6 or 8 years since that started. But he's now in jail.
So 8 years.
Are you looking for a silver lining here, Gareth? It does sound like you're looking for.
No, I know you two are very cynical, and I am too. But the reality is, like, the wheels of justice do turn slowly. We're not talking about McDonald's here. I mean, McDonald's, you order a burger, it's in your hands within seconds, right?
And we've even forgotten what Richard Mdluli's biggest. We've even forgotten what his crime was to start with. But that's, I think, with the overwhelming evidence that we see being presented, in my favorite soapy, The Days of Judge Zondo.
Yes.
Even he is becoming completely exasperated. We saw this week the arrogance that more and more people are coming in front of the judge. He is exasperated with it.
Yeah.
The people with the I don't remember, I forgot, I can't imagine, rubbish. Yesterday also, we spoke a couple of days ago. There is overwhelming evidence of people and corruption and who was involved and where the bodies are hidden. I think the worst thing is we also can see where the bodies are hidden, and yet still there's no movement on the dial, and that's what makes me kind of go, sorry, Shamila, you may have been good over there at the international. What is it, Interpol? This year, South Africa is running away, running off with her.
You make me think of something that I last week, Canton. You'll be pleased to know I went to renew my firearm license at the police station, and I don't go to the police station often because it's not a pleasant place to be. And people who go there have got some real trouble in their lives because you don't go to a police station because it's fun. So I was standing in the queue, and then I got told to go into another queue, and all of this was an interminable process. But eventually, I got to a woman who was, she kind of didn't want to help me, but she had to. And I think I've made a bit of progress. But I couldn't help noticing when I walked into the police station that they had 3 pictures on the wall. They had Stilili in the middle, Cyril, then they had Didi Mabuza, and they had Bheki Cele. Now, Bheki Cele made sense to me. Cyril even made sense.
Didi's up there.
Didi. I thought suddenly, Didi Mabuza. Where is this man? We know he was very sick somewhere in the middle of this COVID thing. And we don't know what he was sick with, but he disappeared completely from the scene. And I'm still wondering, I know I go on a bit like a broken record about this. This guy is not involved in any public duties. We're paying him a lot of money as deputy president. I don't know what he's doing. Does anyone have an answer? Pumi, Canton, please. Didi Mabuza, is he alive? Is he useful to us in any way? What is his purpose?
I suspect that Didi Mabuza is keeping his powder dry because ultimately his role is to displace Cyril. And there really is no need for him to be doing anything else behind the scenes.
Yeah, man, he had a whistle stop to a couple of weeks ago. When he did. He came out just to show everybody that he didn't die of poisoning.
I think that was about a month. That was about a month back, Pumi. Yes.
Yeah, he came out just so we know that he is not yet dead. I was beginning to think he's dead. I really was. speaking of
now,
dead people that are coming.
By the way, guys, just as on the question of what's happening behind the scenes. Isn't the DA supposed to be having their federal council elections sometime round about now?
Oh, that's a good point. And who we got going here? We've got Mbali and Tuli, we've got John Steenhuisen, and we've got someone else.
I've seen quite a couple of I'm with John avatars.
Really? that didn't work very well for Hillary. People should realize that.
I'm with Hillary.
Yeah, I'm with her was her slogan. Yes, it didn't really work well for her.
It was the Gauteng, what's his name? The Gauteng guy. He's in Pretoria in the Tshwane Council, I think. He had a whole thing about I'm with John, the exact kind of leadership.
Salim Samanga, yes.
I'm with John.
He's been accused of sexual harassment this week, but then in politics at the moment, that seems to be what everybody is.
That's kind of the go-to thing, which is why I tend to be reluctant unless charges are actually filed. Charges of sexual harassment pop up, and really what you want is for people to come forward and press charges so that these things can actually be hauled out in the cold light of day.
Well, you would.
So otherwise, I tend to be suspicious of
that. That is. Otherwise, it's not taking seriously the charges. You're only playing for politics if you don't actually lay charges. And so I agree with you, Canton. Let's ignore all sexual harassment charges until they are brought, because then they're a serious thing. If it's just office gossip, a lot of the time it's being used for nefarious purposes. And I mean no disrespect to the victims by saying that. The victims.
Although what you bring up about the DA's current election, like leadership battle, is really the fact that in a couple of months we've got local elections coming up.
That's right.
In the midst of all of this mayhem, in the midst of all of this chaos, even as a lot of people are completely hurtful with the mismanagement of their municipalities and their city councils by the ANC, the failure of the opposition in many different ways to step up and kind of be serious about continues to put all of us in in the hands of the ANC, because who are you going to vote for? Who's there at the DA? Who's there? What are they proposing? What are they going to do? They're busy fighting their own internal battles. The EFF is fighting a big bogey monster out there. If they're not fighting cliques, they're fighting farmers. There's so much disarray
I want to
on
talk
the other
about
side.
that
And then watching.
If you don't
Say
mind,
that again, please, Gareth.
I just want to talk about that EFF fighting cliques and then fighting the Boere and, at Senekal. So here's the thing. I interviewed a guy called Douglas Murray not so long ago. He's written a brilliant book called The Madness of Crowds. And he calls it the St. George in Retirement Syndrome, where I call it struggle envy. Julius grew up, and many of the EFF leadership grew up in a time of post-struggle liberation theology, and they missed out on being in the struggle themselves. I mean, we know Julius was immersed in this as a young man. He was there at Chris Harney's funeral at a very tender age. So this is his religion. And I'm going to refer to what Douglas Murray, his theory is, in a moment, because he obviously is not as involved in our local processes as we might be. But there is something that you could call in South Africa struggle envy. I think it's something that really bothers Julius. It bothers a lot of young people who don't have meaning and purpose in their lives. And for many of them, they substitute that lack of personal meaning for something to struggle against. And this is where Douglas Murray comes into it. St. George in Retirement Syndrome is where, after St. George had slayed the dragon and saved the damsel in distress, he was at his height of fame. And after that, he had to carry on finding new dragons to slay. And the dragons became ever smaller as he would progress through the world, trying to find enemies that weren't there. And eventually, like Don Quixote, he was just tilting at windmills. And the struggles have largely, in terms of race politics in South Africa, been won. It's done and dusted. And they talk about economic freedom because really it's a small dragon in a country where otherwise we've fought the big battles. He wasn't there in the 70s in Soweto. He wasn't there in the 90s when Codesa happened. And all of those massive moves in South African politics, I feel he is a little sad that he wasn't a part of that. And therefore, for them to take on cliques now feels like in the old days of taking on the apartheid regime, but it really isn't. I mean, that was the real struggle. This is a pathetic, small dragon that it's so small you can almost not see it. Shampoo. You're fighting shampoo, for fuck's sake. It's embarrassing. And I think that with these Boere and Senekal, the unfortunate thing that's happened there, and this is probably room and space for a psychologist to bring some expertise to bear. But I can't help thinking, like, you're looking at a bunch of essentially what are private landowners. They don't have any necessary political affiliations. They're certainly not, as far as I can tell, the Boere have not mounted some massive anti-EFF movement in all of the time since 1994. They don't get together in meetings to talk about how they're going to disrupt the EFF. I don't think they've paid any attention to the EFF, frankly, until now. And it's sad. It saddens me that Floyd and Julius and people in that party are tilting at smaller and smaller windmills as time goes by, because they're actually making a mockery of themselves just because they wish they were in the actual struggle. Do you think that's a feasible theory?
Captain, you go first.
Well, that silence is...
You go first.
Canthan, you've muted yourself for some reason. You can't hear us?
Let's try this again. No, for some reason your stuff had suddenly frozen. Okay, yeah. Right. So we're back in action. Look, I think, is it an appropriate thing to be doing to actually be marching to this court to be expressing a sense of real outrage around very real crimes that have been happening around the country? Absolutely. Because every time we have had people marching to courts to do this for other cases where we've had other crimes of violence, where we've had crimes that have involved rapists, we've cheered people on for doing this. And now suddenly, just simply because of the people who happen to be affected, we are switching the narrative around and saying that this is being provocative and all sorts of strange things happening out here. So no, I think that it's absolutely correct that there should be a sense of public outrage around farm murders, and that people should actually be showing their outrage so that one can actually end up drawing attention to it. The question in terms of whether Julius Malema is, suffering from struggle, envy, I don't think so. I think that this is ultimately part of a power play that ties in with the National Democratic Revolution. And he just happens to be the Rottweiler that is being employed by the greater ANC in this particular case. And I think, frankly, if it were not for the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa happens to be president, he would have already made his peace and been firmly within the ranks of the ANC. Because consider that Cyril Ramaphosa chaired the disciplinary hearing that got him fired from the ANC. And I suspect that there's a deep and abiding hatred for the president of the country from the leader of the EFF. And ultimately, I think that that's a good thing for the rest of us, because it's you can always trust egos ahead of principle. And in this particular case, the ego effectively becomes a bit of protection for the rest of the country.
I think it is indicative of the fact that their party is plateauing. Their party and their movement is plateauing. Their leadership is what it is, and it's not. And the party or their movement is never going to be greater than the sum of its leaders. And we know, like Canton says, we know their egos, we know their limitations, and that's where they are. It's going to be a couple of years to see how much further. But they don't have any policies that anybody can speak about or think of or buy into. They just have anger. What they have is they have an anger, and they have chaos, and they're fomenting that and taking advantage of the fact that there are so many other problems. So lots of young people are unemployed. Lots of people are unemployed in this country. We've got more unemployed people of working age than employed people, 18 million people, right? So that anger is easy for them to and also all those people are available for them to bus into every one of these places that they're going into,
Absolutely. Yeah.
But this goes back to the discussion that we had last week, which was, unless you have a narrative that is actually giving people something to look forward to. And Pumi, this ties in with what you were mentioning earlier with regard to the fact that we have local government elections coming up next year. And we still don't have a sense from any of the people who've been stepping forward in terms of what they are going to be offering in terms of those local government elections. That's any different from what anyone else has been offering in the past.
We haven't heard a thing. We haven't heard anybody promising any improvements of any kind. It's just basically we are, and this is happening in the US too, because I know we've got to pay some attention. It is election month. The US elections are in less than a month from now. And you see in America and in South Africa, it's personality politics, but it's also that guy is worse than me. It's not saying I'm good for this and that and the other reason. It's that guy over there is much worse than me. What a horrible juncture we've come to, where the best we can offer is that we're not as shit as the person who we're saying is shit.
So the voter is a little hamstrung. Who do you have? Who do you have? Do you stick with the devil you know, or do you try
but
out
again,
the
it's
new
not.
devil in Mashaba?
But again, it's not a question. It's not a question of who. And once again, we're getting sucked into this entire cult of personality thing. We're looking for heroes to come out and actually save us, as opposed to carving out a common narrative that we can actually end up believing in. And right now, there's no incentive whatsoever for us to be doing this kind of stuff. Now, if we look specifically in terms of what's happened in city of Johannesburg, which after Herman Mashaba's rather abrupt departure from being mayor, means effectively that the city promptly went back into the hands of the ANC. And, frankly, Johannesburg is once again firmly on the path of being the shithole that it has been ever since the collapse of that bridge. When did that bridge collapse? About 5 years ago.
No, it's more than 8 years ago, I think.
Mm-hmm. So we have these elections coming up, and we don't have a sense of anyone who's actually gotten their act together. The DA is still kind of scrambling to decide whether it's ANC light or whether it's actually going to be a party of principle. Mm-hmm. And they haven't been able to emerge with a clear message in terms of what they want to be doing. Herman Mashaba started off by saying that, effectively he's going to be running it on specific principles. And he's then ended up...
all the old people. Every single one of the old guys.
Look. The fortunate thing that we can say is that we didn't have an alliance between Mashaba and Musi, because if that had actually happened, then we would have probably had another Cope scenario where there would have been constant scramble to, in terms of who's going to be top dog. But guys, ultimately, this has to stop being about who happens to be the person who's actually running the show. This has to be about what do you stand for, what do you believe in, what do you think is actually going to be put in place to fix this country.
People are people, though. I mean, Joe Biden has said the absolute minimum, and when he has opened his mouth over the last 6 months, he has shown how discombobulated and senile he is. And that's been good enough for America. And I think that the polls are all showing that he's developing a quite comfortable lead over Donald Trump. But we know the polls can be highly inaccurate. I'm not sure that they can be as inaccurate as to be like 10 points inaccurate. Normally, the point of polling is that they want to be as reasonable as possible and as close to the truth as possible. But we've got an interesting election happening there. I saw some news just this morning has come out about the relationship between Hunter Biden and the Ukraine.
Yeah, I saw that.
And you try and post a link to that New York Post story, which is...
Well, Twitter has been censoring it.
Correct. You try and post that on social media and you actually can't.
And Twitter censors it. Twitter censors it because they say that they have a policy that anything that is derived from the results of hacking, they will not end up promoting. Of course, they had no issue whatsoever in promoting stories in terms of Donald Trump that were derived from his correspondence being hacked. But
and they are 2.5 weeks from election.
Yeah, but this is an interesting jump-off point for us again, Gareth, because there are two issues that I play out here. The one is the attempt of people like Twitter and Facebook and Google at the same level to control the narrative. Because if you do a search for the Great Barrington Declaration, which we've spoken about on Google, Google immediately points you to a range of places that say that this is being put together by climate science denialists, or essentially they try to discredit the entire premise around it in terms of your search results. If you go to Bing or DuckDuckGo, which are other search engines, they do the appropriate thing. They point you to the website, they point you to the Wikipedia entry, and they talk about what it's all about. I had a post that Mike Schussler had put up on Twitter, which I then shared on Facebook. And it was basically a link to a YouTube video of a lawyer in Germany who has successfully sued Volkswagen on behalf of the workers there, who was actually threatening to bring legal action against governments based on the overall impact of the lockdown on the livelihoods of people and a range of things like that. So I take this video, post it on Facebook, and Facebook then flags it as fake news. Except I tried to look for an explanation as to why Facebook has flagged it as fake news. But the article that is refuting this is written in some other language that uses alphabet that looks vaguely like Cyrillic. I'm not sure what language it actually is. But yeah, there's no recourse. Something automatically gets flagged as fake news,
So
and you have no way of drilling down to it. So we've got that example. We've got Google in terms of the Great Barrington Declaration. We've got the New York Post article being censored by Twitter simply because they are making a judgment not based on the fact that there's been a court order that says this is a result of hacking and therefore you must not publish it. No, Twitter is taking a very deliberate political stance that says this is going to happen.
So, in the camp for Joe Biden, essentially.
Yeah. Well, they're in the camp with someone. It just so happens that they happen to be backing a Joe Biden narrative at this point. But let's go back to the question of all of those polls that are showing a 10-point lead in terms of the likes of Biden versus Trump. And let's look back to the 2016 polls. And in fact, there's a substantial Wikipedia page that details the polls, what they were showing ahead of the 2016 elections. And those were showing leads of better than 6 points in most cases for Hillary versus Trump. And we all know where that ultimately turned out. And then you have me, who's made some very specific predictions in terms of the fact that I expect Trump to be taking states like Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Florida and Michigan, among others. And the reason why I've been saying stuff like this is because I try to look behind the scenes over and above what is being pushed by the headlines that pop up on Twitter. And there's a couple of interesting things that I just want to go into that I've come across. Let me see if I can just get into this. So, a number of states, you can actually have a scenario where you register as a voter, but also indicate what your party is. So Florida, okay, since March this year, they've added 195,652 Republicans, 98,362 Democrats. Pennsylvania since June, Republicans who've registered, 135,619, Democrats, 57,985. North Carolina, Republicans, 83,785, Democrats, 38,000.
Right.
So in other words, what's happening is that there are all of these little indicators that no one is talking about. So the polls are showing one story, but behind the scenes, people who are actually mobilizing on the ground has actually been shifting. Then there are these other little indicators that keep popping up. So support for Donald Trump among Black voters has been growing. So very specific polls have been showing that has actually been increasing. Now, on the one hand, you're saying there's a scenario where there's an overall increase in support for Biden, but then at the same time, you're saying that there's an increase in support among minority voters for Trump, and something doesn't add up in terms of the logic. And what it comes back to is, again, my belief.
We don't
talk go ahead, Pumi.
I think the other thing that just in terms of those indicators is that the American electoral system is also not as simple as just a popular vote. So there's the popular vote on the one hand, and then there's also the collegiate. There's the way that the voting outweighs each other as well. And I, unfortunately, like you, can't think that Donald Trump is coming back. It's going to be another 4 years.
That's actually well. That's actually my prediction based on actually reading the data and trying to get a sense of, but starting on the assumption that the pollsters 2016 showed us conclusively that they got it wrong. Conclusively. And you see, after the fact, they kept trying to say, well, Hillary actually won the popular vote. But fundamentally, what it comes down to is what happens in those battleground states that are actually needed to carry the presidency. And that for me is is going to be the issue. So, on the assumption that the Democrats are able to actually get a substantial increase in terms of the mail-in ballots, I think that there's a strong possibility that these guys are likely to pull the majority in terms of that of the postal votes. So I think that the postal votes will actually end up being kind of like in the order of 57% going for the Democrats,
I think there's going to be a huge amount of contestation post-election.
Yes.
We're going to have court cases. It's going to drag on for months. We'll only be able to really get the definitive answer probably by February of next year, because they're going to be legal situations mounted in various states. It's going to be very messy, Canton.
Absolutely, and by all the indications, the Democrats are gearing up their legal systems, and every time he gets a chance to say it, Donald Trump also just kind of puts it in there, jabs it in there to say, this election's going to be something else. It's going to be contested. They're going to try, just go and watch them at the polls, watch what they're doing, this mail-in, the fraud that's going to happen. All of those kinds of things are just setting up for what's coming post the election. And I think one of the things that we also don't take into when we talk about the American election is we also don't always realize that ballot has much more than just the presidential candidates. In all of those various states, it's all the it's the attorney general is on the ballot. It's all of those kinds of things that are on the ballot too, and that's where the contestation is going to be. There's going to be a lot of movement post the election around those things.
Well, let's see what happens. As Canton says, we've got to also maintain some sense of what the polls did and didn't get right before, and what Silicon Valley wants you to do, and who they're really operating for, because they're operating in their own interests, not in the interests of free speech or an equal representation of viewpoints online.
Look, I think the basic takeaway that if I look in terms of what's been happening right now in terms of media manipulation, and let's be very clear, media manipulation is happening. There is a very specific narrative that's going on. One of the things, for example, that I came across was the fact that Roger Waters, who, Roger Waters as in the brains behind Pink Floyd, as opposed to Gilmour, who's the musical genius behind Pink Floyd.
Okay.
Yes, but Roger Waters was basically cancelled by Amnesty International on the basis that he was pointing out that the white helmets, who were the guys who were wreaking havoc in Syria, were basically a front organization for terrorists, and that it was very likely that the Western powers were going to be using them as an excuse to once again bomb Syria. And he ends up getting cancelled for it. Now, understand that Roger Waters has very strong feelings on things like Venezuela, for example, where he takes the view that people should not be interfering in terms of trying to effect regime change in Venezuela. And people are very happy to promote Roger Waters in a particular context. So, for example, if he speaks out in favor of the Palestinians, then there's a substantial body of people who are willing to back Roger Waters on that. But as soon as he says something that is contrary to a prevailing narrative, then people end up stepping in. And this entire idea of trying to work out who is driving the agenda that says that it's okay to trumpet J.K. Rowling when she happens to be speaking out against Donald Trump. It's not okay to promote J.K. Rowling when she says that women have to,
women are women,
that men are men and women are women.
Kenton,
so all of these things are happening behind the scenes.
Start a conversation about cancel culture at like 2 minutes to Chayula time.
No, I'm not. But we're not talking about cancel culture, guys. What I want to point out, okay, is that the next big challenge is not going to come in terms of the alternative media platforms, because we've already seen that platforms such as the one that we are on right now actually become a primary source of information for a significant chunk of people. But ultimately, what we have to worry about is the ability of people to turn off the hardware that ultimately drives these various platforms. And we've seen it happening in cases like Jeremy Nell being forced off various platforms just simply because of the fact that he happens to be pushing a particular narrative.
I can tell that we're not going to resolve this one now. I want to save it for next week, if you don't mind. We can put it on the agenda. And Pumi, will you come back? Because
he can't do this. This guy, he can't just start. This is a big one that you're opening up like this at this moment. Speaking of people we should be worried about who can turn off the platform,
let me summarize. If I am correct and Trump wins the election, then we have, in fact, proof positive that everyone in the media has been spinning us in terms of the polls over the past period. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, tell me your last word, because I don't want you to go without having to put Captain in his place a little bit.
Dude, he's had so much time to say all of his talk. And then to summarize.
I love you too, Pumi.
I think the opening salvo of the next show should be we're going to break down what the idea of turning on and turning off what people can and cannot hear or see or read, and how different it is today now that it's a digital medium versus when it was print publications and it was Rupert Murdoch. Come on, guys.
All right, so we've got a full agenda already for next Thursday. Round for that one. Pumi, Canton, thank you very much. This segment fired up by Nando's. As spring has sprung, so too has a new Nando's menu. And for those who see it half full, you can get out your phone, you can open the free Nando's mobile app, and you can order half a chicken and any single side for how much do you think? Just 87 Rand. If you're thirsty and you don't want to let the heat of the African sun get you down, add a frosted raspberry lemonade or cocoa pine frosted drink to cool you off for 25 Rand. And that's all.
See, I take out that phone app already and just order. You know my home address. I'll expect delivery shortly. Thank you.
Right. And Single T on the comments this morning saying, I'm definitely having Nando's for lunch today. Well, that's a man of some style. Mick Jagger might have said. All right. Thank you very much, Pums. Thank you very much, Canthan.